Hey everybody, I'm Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome to the latest installation of the Inside the Issues podcast. Again, so much to talk about. And again, we're seeing how much the situation in the Middle East is having ripple effects thousands of miles away right here in Southern California. We will be talking about that.
Absolutely. And Californians in Congress, things are getting a little testy in the House of Representatives, how the Golden State could play a big role in the 2024 election.
And I feel like we've been talking about international politics and national politics a lot in recent weeks. There's a really good, juicy local political story. It's all about redistricting and elections and recalls. It's happening in Santa Ana. If you hadn't heard about it yet, we're going to fill you in on everything that's happening on that front. But we'll begin with the Middle East and the situation there. And I just feel like, Sara, things have been so polarized now the entire month of October, and now November has just begun. And I don't think that's going to stop at all.
Yeah, and it's funny, the word polarized, right? I mean, we often think about that term as something that's polarizing between Democrats and Republicans. But here, what we're really seeing is this polarization amongst those on the left, let me say it that way, not necessarily amongst those who are identified as Democrats per se, but amongst the left, with so many statements coming out on college campuses, protests happening throughout the city, and of course what we're seeing, as we've seen a rise in Islamophobia, we're also now seeing a rise in anti-Semitic acts of hate as well. Certainly here in California, news out just recently about Canter's Deli.
Yeah, there's a famous mural outside there. And earlier this week, there were some really awful anti-Semitic slurs that were spray painted on the side of the building. And this was, Katie Yaroslavsky said that there's been at least 7 reports of anti-Semitic graffiti throughout her district. And LAPD is investigating. Certainly this is being looked at as a hate crime. They painted over what was said, but there were, shop owners nearby who, found the things spray painted in front of their stores. And it's very clear that things are heating up more and more and more. And what we've been talking about now for several weeks, this kind of whose side are you on and how much do you stand on that side and what does being on that side mean to you? I think I don't see any end of that in sight. And I think it's really triggering some very heated, difficult conversations with a lot of yelling at each other, yelling past each other, instead of really trying to engage in dialogue about what this situation in the Middle East means and what it means for us here locally as well.
Yeah, and I can't help but think also about this us versus them mentality, right? So within political science, within social psychology, we think about social identity theory, and one of the roots of this is this us versus them mentality, this way in which humans tend to gravitate towards team-like mentality. There was this experiment done in the 1950s where they took 11-year-old boys out to the woods, put them in 2 different cabins. They didn't even know that the 2 different cabins existed. They formed bonds. They didn't know each other.
Sounds
going
really
into it.
Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, it really does, right? But then they meet each other and, all hell breaks loose, right? Like they start by playing games together, playing baseball, but quickly it descends into, attacking each other, fights breaking out. This kind of us versus them mentality is so easy, I think, for us as humans to fall into. And it's so sad, I think, when we're seeing this kind of momentum occurring. We can hold space for Israelis, for Palestinians, for all of the folks that are involved. But when we see it actually taking on this violent approach here at home in the United States, it's a really unfortunate thing to be seeing. We've, of course, saw yesterday the White House coming out with a statement and plan to combat Islamophobia throughout the United States. I don't know if do you have more info? It seemed like we're waiting for more information on what that exactly means.
As I understand it, the Biden administration has been very clearly saying that they support Israel, and that is understandably not going over really well with a lot of Muslim and Arab Americans who may not be a a huge part of the electorate, but they are part of the electorate. And we're seeing some of his support numbers dwindling amongst that community. So the Biden administration comes out and says, even though we stand with Israel, we want to make sure. And even before the month of October, we saw the Biden administration, we've talked about this before with Doug Emhoff, really working to curb anti-Semitism. So there's also I saw it as a reaching out saying, don't worry, for those of you who are Muslim American, we also are seeing you. Unclear what the specifics of that will be. But what I also heard, and I think it's so interesting, is these kind of reverberations of what we saw after 9/11, right? And there were so many just terrifying or horrific examples of. And some people weren't even Muslims, like Sikhs, because of head coverings getting beaten up and whatever.
Anyone of South Asian descent certainly was having increased scrutiny, for sure, in my family.
So I think, there's this whole notion of, I heard a report, that the FBI was monitoring Muslim communities in the northern part of the state. And I've been wondering,
recently
too. Recently. And that's what they were saying, like, whoa, we remember what happened after 9/11. We are not going to let this happen again. And I have a feeling similar things are happening here in Southern California as well, because those are really scary times. There was a big story that I remember covering after 9/11 of a man, his name was Craig Monte, that the FBI had worked with to infiltrate mosques in Southern California, try to fire, right? And then when that came out, these mosques just felt so betrayed. Like, why is the FBI surveilling us in this way, that they sent someone undercover? And so much work happened to try to repair the damage done by that. To think that some of that might be coming up all over again is there's a lot of work.
It's heavy stuff
to be done.
There really is.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to add on to all of this, right? Like, there's so many reverberations in 1,000 different directions here, but this really came home to roost in terms of some of the anti-Semitism this week with a staffer of Hugo Soto Martinez from the city council making some very crass comments and anti-Semitic comments about Amy Schumer, the comedian, on X, formerly known as Twitter.
Yes, and I think this is a good place to introduce the segment that we do here every week. It is something we like to call What's the Word? The word is
cancel.
Yeah. I mean, cancel culture is something we've certainly talked about here before. So this is basically what happened. This guy, Josh Androsky, he worked on Hugo Soto Martinez's campaign when Hugo won. He's now representing my district, CD 13. He's been working in the senior advisor capacity, and he posted, as you mentioned, comedian Amy Schumer. He was responding to some not so great, many considered misogynistic, anti-Semitic remarks and fat phobic. There's some good old body shaming. We'll put links to them. I don't necessarily feel like we need to say them or give them any more oxygen. But it came out really quickly. Of course, as things happen, people jumped onto it really quickly. And then there was this very quick succession of events. Josh Androsky initially deleted the X post. Then he deleted his entire X account. And we should also notice, Josh, I think I mentioned, he's Jewish. He was also a comedy writer. He's a political campaign consultant. And there are a lot of people who kind of have made that transition between poking fun and then using that as a way to help candidates get elected. So this was kind of within his wheelhouse. And I think there's a lot to maybe be explored about what was the intent here. Was it really to say these things about Amy Schumer? Was it more about having the funny play on words? But either way, sometimes it's not about intent. It's about the impact.
Well, no, I'll just push back a little bit there, right? I mean, I very much understand you're wearing multiple hats, that you have this one life as perhaps as a comedian, but you also have this other life as being a staffer for a council member. And having worked on multiple campaigns, my understanding is not just Hugo Soto Martinez, but also Eunice Hernandez, Aaron Darling that ran against Tracy Park, Nithya Raman, I believe as well. Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course.
Yeah, people will.
Right. I'm sure they will. But when you're wearing multiple hats and wearing the comedian hat role while at the same time representing an elected official, that's a really tough tough needle to thread there, especially when you're making these kinds of comments. You know, we have seen many comedians being canceled for the kinds of comments that they make, especially about their own communities at times, or about other communities. And I certainly can understand the artistic nature of poking fun. But when you're also at the same time representing an elected official, you need to be wearing that hat when you're on social media.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
I spoke with a Democratic strategist, Michael Trujillo, who's had his own situations where he made remarks that were really not appropriate at the time and then had to rescind and wondered, is my career going to be over? And what he mentioned, I think it's really interesting, is that, you know, there's been these scientific studies about the dopamine release that we get from engaging in social media in that moment of like, I've got the great zinger or whatever. And I think we as humans just naturally, I mean, they've proven it. It's like, you know, people at the slot machines and that kind of release that you get. But as you mentioned, you have to balance that with the very more long-term understanding that you are working. Your taxpayer dollars are funding your work. So if you're doing that, that is not going to ring out. There was kind of an additional layer to all of this because when it came out, a lot of people were really upset and were really hoping, you know, Josh kind of canceled himself. He, you know, stepped out of his post.
Which some people were upset about, that Ugo didn't fire him. And, you know, I mean, Ugo did say that the post sickened him. Mayor Bass said that the remarks were disgusting and dangerous. But then there's the question. I mean, I think it's not just who should be canceled, but who is the person to do the canceling when it comes to something like eliminating a person's job. And I think there's also questions to be raised. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road to Josh Androsky. It goes back to the whole, you know, the leaked City Hall recording. And Nuri Martinez, her career ostensibly is over. And yet Kevin De Leon's remains. And remember Ana Guerrero, who worked with Mayor Garcetti and made all these remarks about Dolores Huerta. And everyone thought, that's it, that's the end of her career. But it wasn't necessarily. Like she went on to continue working in politics. And I think it's such an interesting alchemy of like, who gets to come back? When do they get to come back? Why do they get to come back? Why do some people make remarks that like everybody pounces on, and then other people might say or do things that just kind of keep going on? And there's no, if anyone's looking for any like black or white kind of formula that you can plug in, there really isn't, which is super interesting. It sure is. It sure is.
And the cancel situation, I think, also brings us to our next topic, which is to go back to look at Congress once again, talking about things that people have posted on social media. Congresswoman Rashida Talib of Michigan, when there was the hospital bombing in Gaza, you know, she posted with some pretty stern condemnation. And then, of course, there were all these reports. And I don't know if we'll ever know who or what was truly responsible for the bombing of that hospital. But she kind of stood her ground on that. Republican Marjorie Taylor Green said that was reprehensible and introduced this motion to censor Rashida Talib. It kind of went down in flames because not all of her Republican colleagues were on board with it. Again, who gets canceled, who doesn't, and why. You know?
Exactly. And this is having some reverberations here in Southern California in particular, because let's not forget that while California is generally speaking a blue state, we have several Republicans in Congress, particularly from Orange County and other places. And this seems to be having some reverberations for some of the Orange County Republicans.
It sure does. In particular, Congresswoman Young Kim and Marjorie Taylor Green did a little appearance with Tucker Carlson to talk about kind of the role that she has within the GOP versus the role that someone like Young Kim has in the GOP and what Marjorie Taylor Green thinks is driving all of this. Let's take a listen.
When the NRCC puts out a letter, they'll have someone like Young Kim sign it, even though she's one of the people that voted to kick me off of committees. So she votes with Democrats and also enters, she puts and passes co-sponsors legislation with one of the most radical Democrats from my state, Carolyn Boudreaux, who is I call her a communist Georgia State college professor. And so that's who Young Kim teams up with, but she's a Republican. But these are the Republican women that our GOP has been promoting because they fill the identity politics.
Sara, identity politics. I mean, I knew what I heard as like the, Harold Pinter subtext to all of this.
Yeah.
What did you hear?
Wow. I mean, suggesting that she's just filling some identity politics role about what the GOP perhaps needs to be doing. I would argue the GOP does need to be doing more out.
And let's just say young Kim is
she's Korean American.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And in a seat that's also relatively safe for her. I'm curious, what were you hearing?
Yeah, I heard identity politics. I was like, wow, okay, is that Marjorie Taylor Greene's not so veiled way of saying, well, they're picking her because she's Asian and the GOP needs to bring in more people of color because we're losing our numbers. Like, I don't know what other read you could possibly have on that. And I thought that was
rather... quite frankly, the California GOP has done a better job of bringing in people of color. And the National Republican Party should probably take note.
Yeah, absolutely. But to say that so bluntly, I mean, I don't know. There's very little that Marjorie Taylor Greene says that should surprise me anymore, and yet it still does surprise me. And I think, it's going to be very interesting, continuing on what we were talking about last week with the election of Mike Johnson to be Speaker of the House, to see what we've been seeing basically ever since the 2016 election, these two factions within the GOP, those that support Trump and those who don't.
Right.
And it's just been this wobbling of, I feel like, it's this tug of war or the ship where you just see kind of things going back and forth. And certainly the election of Mike Johnson, a very big win for the pro-MAGA camp. But, here in California, I don't know how much of that flies, even though there's widespread support for Donald Trump. But just this week, the Cook Report, which is really considered like the experts in terms of like the Las Vegas bet makers of what's happening in Congress, they are looking at, they have this whole kind of scorecard that looks at how much of a toss-up a seat might be. And there are 4 seats that are rated as potentially toss-ups, including the 27th District with Mike Garcia, and the 41st District out in the Inland Empire with Ken Calvert. And really interesting to see, are these going to be seats that go blue? And I don't know, will it be because of Donald Trump? Will it be because of Mike Johnson? Will it be all of the above?
Or will it be because of the challengers to these sitting members of Congress are doing a good outreach to voters to get them their support?
Yeah.
I've looked at many of these districts for many years, in Orange County in particular, even before redistricting. And, obviously these are districts that have changed significantly since 2020. Voters are interesting, right? Throughout these areas, there have been times where you can find a pushback to the Trump effect while still maintaining support for incumbents. And the incumbency advantage is very real in many of these instances, particularly when you don't have a challenger who is actually speaking the language of the voters themselves. Certainly when we look at, for example, Mike Garcia's district in the Santa Clarita up through the Antelope Valley, this is an area that has undergone significant growth. It has undergone a lot of demographic change. It's also an area in need of a lot of services. It's an area with a lot of folks with a military background that would likely lean a little bit more conservative, perhaps. Not always, but certainly that's kind of the demographic. And so if you don't have candidates that are actually doing that outreach to people where they're at, then it still becomes difficult, even if this district might even go to Biden, as it did in 2020, right?
Yeah.
And Ken Calvert's district, very different as well, with a much larger LGBTQ community with the Palm Springs area now included.
I wonder too if there's going to be a COVID effect in that we saw a lot of people leave the urban centers like LA and move out to these more the more suburban areas like Santa Clarita. A lot of people I've heard just kind of anecdotally, leaving LA and moving out to the desert. And will we see some demographic shifts on that front as well? So many different factors. And, the fact that Kevin McCarthy, who as a Californian and as a House Speaker and as someone who had just been in that business for so long, raising money for a lot of these local candidates, and now the House Speaker is someone different who does not have that much experience raising money, who is not from California, who doesn't necessarily seem to, I think if it were a choice between who to cancel, young Kim or Marjorie Taylor Greene, think I know who Mike Johnson would be going with.
Yeah,
you know?
I think that's right. And the McCarthy piece, I think you're so right. I mean, so many of these Republicans are trying to walk this tightrope between support for Trump, but also kind of level-headedness, get the job done, which I think is really what McCarthy was attempting to do. And so I think in that role as Speaker, he was able to provide a lot of cover for some of these, the Republicans that are in these swing districts. And so now with him ousted, will he even be able to continue to play such a role?
Yeah.
Really unknown.
I would talk about that forever, but I think we should stay with Orange County, which even hearing you talk about it, Sara, I just feel like it has become the kind of petri dish of looking at not just California politics, but national politics,
absolutely.
because you really see kind of the most extreme dynamics of pulling this way, pulling another, which I think is at the core of a really interesting story that is unfolding in the city of Santa Ana, or Santana, as I heard it. But I'm not, my accent there is not great. But I listened through to a city council meeting that happened at the beginning part of the week, and a big debate there that is happening over, in LA, in the city of LA, we do districts. In Santa Ana, there are wards. And there was a city council woman named Jessie Lopez. She's in Ward 3. It is the northeastern corner of the district. And some people there seem to really like her. Some people there seem to really not like her and are trying to recall her. And we've talked before about the recall fever that we have here in California. So right now, as we speak, there is a recall election that is happening.
Ballots have been sent out.
Yeah. And then I think in-person voting kicks off November 4th. And it all, the official end of the election, we don't call it election day or election night anymore, but that is November 14th. So here's what happens. The basic 101 on recalls is you first of all, before you have the election, because elections cost money and time and effort, you got to make sure there's an appetite for it, right? So you have to get enough petition signatures, right? What we saw with George Gascon. That was unsuccessful. This one for Jessie Lopez was. But then the Orange County Registrar, Bob Page, sent out a letter late last month saying, hey, guys, there's a little glitch.
We made a little
Here.
glitch. That's right. We used the district from the past, not the district, or the district of today.
Now, yes.
Not the district from before. And we needed to use the district from before of the voters who actually elected Jessie Lopez, which makes total sense. Yeah. He went on to talk about how several years ago, then Attorney General Kamala Harris had actually issued a notification about how these kinds of matters have to be handled, saying, yes, you absolutely have to use the district boundaries that were in place when this person was elected. And what that has left is not enough signatures collected, which we would assume that then makes this an illegitimate election.
And people who are supporting the recall say, hey, it doesn't matter which district drawings you do, either way, there would have been enough. But the tricky part is, we don't know that for sure. Yeah. And what we do know is that, so there was about 1,000 people who were part of the election where she was originally elected. They don't have ballots, period. They're they have been kind of shunted away from this process. And then there's a couple hundred people who didn't vote in that first election who are now being asked to. Right. So there's this big, and then there's the issues that she's being criticized for. Critics say she has calling for defunding of the police, that she didn't support a ban on street racing in the district, and that is unsafe. That she's proposed this vacancy tax, and a lot of places have saying you can't leave places empty when we have a housing crisis.
Right. Well, and let's just also be very clear about who it is that's funding this recall effort, right? It's the police union down in Santa Ana. It is real estate agencies that are also funding it. Upwards of $500,000 have been put into this effort to advance this. And this same crew has also previously already ousted one other council member. This all came to head earlier this week at the Santa Ana City Council, in which council members were really grappling with and trying to figure out what do we do with this letter from the registrar, Bob Page? And just one other note.
Sure.
Bob Page is new to this job, right?
That's right. He's replacing Neil
Kelly, who was there for years and retired earlier this year. Bob Page coming from, I believe, San Bernardino.
That's right.
But is new.
So he's not a newcomer to this.
No,
and
right.
He's familiar with the law.
Right.
And he basically called
but
on
new to Orange County.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And at the city council meeting, I mean, I listened and watched through. There were a lot of people on both sides of this. It was very clear, really speaking out about it. And the council eventually, they met behind closed doors and they came out. Eventually, they didn't do anything. They deadlocked. They had these two options: either cancel the recall or just kind of
let it play
out and see what happens. And let's take a listen to. Here is David Pendelosa. He's a Santa Ana City Council member. When they kind of came back after all of this, here's what he had to say.
Knowing that there are 6,000 plus people in Ward 3, like we heard from many of them tonight, both supportive and against the recall, that have been told that there was going to be an election, that there is an election happening right now. So I feel that it is the best course of action to take no action.
And Sara, I just heard this as not me, please, someone else. And I think that a lot of times you get in those decisions where you realize I can't make everybody happy. Let's let someone else weigh in. So the options are if a judge weighed in and said
if
stop
someone
the
takes
election,
legal action,
but otherwise, and that's possible.
Right.
We're, a couple days away left before November 14th.
Right.
But really will be interesting to see if it continues what the actual results are.
Well, one group that weighed in was the editorial board of the Orange County Registrar, saying absolutely this election should not move forward, even though they disagree with Jesse Lopez's politics. They feel like this election is completely illegitimate and allowing the police union to have a run over Santa Ana and having way too much power. So Orange County Registrar's editorial board making a strong statement there.
And finally, in case you missed it, last week on the podcast, we talked about Gavin Newsom's trip to China and everything that it meant from climate change to international relations. But who would have thunk that maybe one of the biggest moments out of that trip would be one that was entirely unexpected? Sara, do you want to explain what happened?
Gavin Newsom was out shooting hoops with kids in the neighborhood and took a little spill wearing dress shoes while playing basketball. Never a good idea to wear dress shoes while playing basketball.
And he didn't just take a spill. He took out a kid with him, right? I mean, and it's just, not a very good look. Again, perspective, right? It's interesting. I've watched several different video versions of this, and the one that the GOP and the right is really having a field day with is you see him knock the kid over, and what do you do? My God, it's a kid. You don't know him. You do not even speak the same language. I used to teach in Japan, and I like little kids, and there are all sorts of things where I was like, I don't know what to say or do. And I will say, I do understand the instinct in those moments that you kind of use your body to communicate what your language cannot.
Yes.
So Newsom kind of wrestles with the kid and then kind of makes it look like he's spanking him, and that only makes things worse. And the right had a field day with that. Man, oh man, oh man. And then folks saying trying to, I guess Boris Johnson of England was once in Japan, and there was a similar moment, and was some kind of competition to outdo Boris Johnson's record. Just goes to show you, I think what's the moral of the story? Don't wear dress shoes on the court.
Don't wear dress shoes,
There you go. If you've got a different takeaway from that moment, we would love to hear it. You can find us on all the social media platforms. I am at Alex Cohen in LA.
I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
And we'll see you here next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.